All right, miracles of Christ. Hold on. You start the right place. There we are. The blind man at Bethsaida. Blind man at Bethsaida.
This is new, right?
Yes. Jesus healed the blind, and here's the Old Testament prophecy that would tell us that he was going to do that. He said, "Now the Lord hath called thee in righteousness, and will hold thine hand, and will keep thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, for a light of the Gentiles, to open the blind eyes, bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in darkness out of the prison house." Now, this prophecy is important because it does tell us that when Jesus comes, and when the Messiah comes, one way that they'll know that he truly is the Messiah would be by these healings, these miracles. I've mentioned before, Gamaliel, the leader of the Pharisees, the teacher of the Pharisees, commented about others who have come before claiming to be the Messiah. Judas of Galilee, he came and deceived many people, had many followers, but Gamaliel says, "Where is he at now?" Well, he's dead. You know? And another guy named Theudas, he mentions, is coming and doing the exact same thing. Where's he at? Well, he's gone. He's dead too. And so Gamaliel warns them, said, "Listen, if this truly is of God, you can't stop it. But if it's not of God, it's going to fall on something." And that's absolutely the right way that they should have looked at it. But God gave them so much information about the coming of the Messiah. I mean, we have no idea when their rapture is going to be. I believe it's going to be soon, and I believe it could be very, very, very soon. But we have no way of knowing. But the Jews had every way of knowing when Jesus would come. I mean, it was all foretold in the Old Testament. Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel, the prophecy of the 490 years, was given to show when the Messiah would come and die. In fact, it tells us, after 62 and 7 weeks, or 483 years, the Messiah would come and he would die. You take that to the story of the wise men who came from the east seeking after the Messiah. Why did they come at that time? Well, I personally believe that the wise men were Jews who lived in the east, in Persia, Greece, and Rome at that time, up to that time. Their ancestors were there in captivity with Daniel, because when the Jews came out of captivity, not all the Jews came out. Many Jews decided to stay back in the land, because that's where they were born, that's where their families were at, they had property, what have you, and so they continued to live there. But full well knowing the prophecy that Daniel gave. And Daniel said, from the going forth the command to restore and build Jerusalem until the coming Messiah, and everything put together would be 483 years. So Daniel explains exactly when Jesus would come. Well, they're living there in Persia with Daniel. Daniel's going to tell them, the prophecy, and so they know the prophecy. And then the time period began, Daniel said, from the going forth of the command to build, restore the streets. When that happened, well, Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 2, when he left to go rebuild the streets, the clock began, the calendar began. And so the Jews would have known that. They had ways of keeping calendar back then, different from what we do, but they still had ways of doing that. And so they knew that, when the command went forth, so the Jews living in Persia at the time saying, 483 years, the Messiah will come and die. They knew when he would come, and they knew when he would die. They did not know when he'd be born. Because we know he was 33 when he died. They didn't know that. Could he have lived to 60 before he died? Sure. Could he have died at 20? Yeah. So they had no idea of knowing. And so I believe, because I get so irritated with Sunday school literature and commentaries who say that the wise men were astrologers and who they worshiped the star. When they saw this unique star, that they followed it because it wasn't on their other charts, and so that's why they came. Now, that's baloney. It makes no sense whatsoever. We know that when they came, they knew when Jesus would be born. they even told Herod that, the Messiah, so they weren't looking for a star, they were looking for the Messiah. And so what they started doing as time went on, after 483 years, it gets closer and closer and closer. Let's say it's 100 years now before we're born. And they know that 100 years from now that the Messiah would come. So they start praying, Lord, show us, give us a sign. Can you do that in the Old Testament? Yeah. Because they didn't have the inner witness of the Holy Spirit of God. So as time got close, 50 years now before the Messiah comes. So they're praying, Lord, show us a sign that we can go there and worship the Messiah. Time got closer. Now it's 35 years. And they start praying. A few years later, they get a sign. You know, maybe a year before he was born. Who knows how long it took him to travel there. It wouldn't take him that a year, but several months before, God sent him a sign of a star. And so they went after the star, not following the star, but following the star's direction toward Bethlehem, to the Messiah. And like I said, they didn't know he would be born, so they had to pray, Lord, show us when. And they've come to find out it was 33 years before he would die. And so those things were very, very important. They knew when he would come. They knew that when he came, they knew that he would open the blind eyes. They knew that he would heal the lepers. Had that ever been done before? No. I mean, God gave them the way of figuring things out. If a man is cured of leprosy, he's to go to the priest to have himself declared clean. When Jesus came, it's the first time anybody like that, well, I mean, name in the Old Testament, there were few in the Old Testament, but Jesus healed in order to prove that he was the Messiah. He told them, once you're healed, go back to the priest, declare yourself clean. So he followed the law. So when Messiah came, he fulfilled the commandment, Micah 5:2, that he be born in Bethlehem Ephratah, it says, because there were two, possibly three Bethlehems in Israel at that time. One map I saw there was three, and one map I saw two. But nevertheless, they didn't know which Bethlehem, except for Micah 5:2, which says Bethlehem Ephratah. So when the wise men came, they knew where he'd be born at. So that's why they came in. They came to Jerusalem because it was a couple years later. Remember, before they got there, probably 2 years after the birth of the Messiah. Again, not knowing exactly when he'd be born and following the star, and that's why they went to Herod. And then Herod says, go worship him and come back and tell me about it because I want to worship him too. And they thought, I don't think so. But remember, they went to the house. Right? They didn't go to the manger. They went to the house. And so, again, that's one of the weird things about the world. All nativity scenes that I've ever seen, the wise men are at the nativity scene.
Except for Tanglewood, Festival of Lights.
Oh, they don't?
They have the wise men traveling too. They're not there.
Oh, really?
I said, somebody got it right.
Oh, I didn't know
Well,
that.
they were technically, not technically, but they were traveling too.
closer
And then
anyway.
you had
Yeah.
the nativity.
Ah.
So they're not together.
Yeah.
Good. You're right, somebody finally got it right.
About right, yeah.
Yeah. Was the little drummer boy thing?
No, I didn't see that.
But again, everything's prophesied. So there was no reason that the Jews should not recognize Jesus as Messiah if they wanted to. And a lot of them, though, did recognize him. I mean, we tend to think, the Jews rejected him, so all the Jews were cut off. Look, the disciples were Jews. Other Jews. John was a Jew. Many people did recognize him. Many people did get saved, but the Jews as a whole rejected him. And that's why the church age began, and they missed out. Here, Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is up north, Sea of Galilee. The northeast side of Galilee, around here somewhere. They meet the blind man. And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring the blind man unto him and besought him to touch him. very similar situation in Mark. Mark talks about a man who had been paralyzed. He talked about the man that his 4 friends brought him and let him down to the roof. And Jesus spoke to him, and he immediately got up and went away glorifying God. Well, here's the blind man who comes, and his friends believe that Jesus could heal him. But at this point in time, there's no evidence of salvation. And lead him, again, similar to the deaf mute in Mark 7. Mark says he took him aside from the multitude, put his fingers in his ears, and he spit and touched his tongue. Jesus removes this blind man from town. He's with the people of Bethsaida, but he leads him out, away. There's a reason for this as well. It's not just... Jesus had healed quite a few by this point, and great multitudes at times come, and he healed. The Bible says some of the occasions he healed every one of them. But remember, the main point is that Jesus did not come to heal anybody. He didn't come so that the blind would see. He didn't come so the lame would walk. He came to die. When I first started college back in 1990, I had my office in the church library. And the church library had been there for however many years. And probably the closest to the best book in the church library was one called Johnny Cash, A Man in Black. The rest of them were worthless books. Who, I assume what happened somewhere down the line, the church wanted to start a library, so he told people, y'all got any spare books, bring them and put them in the church library. And they did, and they were, worthless books. And then the religious books, I started going through them, and I remember opening up one, and it said that Jesus did not know that he was going to die. Well, I didn't just throw it in the dumpster. I didn't throw any of them just in the dumpster. I tore them apart and threw them in the dumpster. And almost every single book in that library, they were old Southern Baptist books, and some of the Southern Baptists are good, and some are not, and these were not. They were just worthless books. Time after time, where Jesus didn't know this, or they didn't know this, or the Bible is not actually correct in this point, kind of thing. So I tossed them all, get rid of them all.
If he was scared to die, he was asking for another way out.
Yeah, it's just amazing how many so-called theologians believe that. I don't know why they bother. In this case, the man's healed in 2 different stages. They took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught, if he saw anything. The man goes on to say, he says, "Now I looked up and said, well, I see men as trees walking." In other words, he looked up and blurry things out there and kind of looked like trees, but they're moving, a lot of these images moving. Apparently at one point in this man's life he could see. And blindness, I can't imagine how many people were actually considered blind in Jesus' day. Because today, we have glasses or contacts or laser surgery, what have you, and a lot of people can see and would not in any way whatsoever consider themselves to be blind. If they take their glasses off, they can't see anything, but with glasses, they're not blind. Back then, they didn't have glasses. And so, I've heard people get older. My eyes have gone quite a bit over the years. I have to have them to read. So in Jesus' days, probably a lot of people that would be considered blind.
Did they have cataracts back then?
I think they had Lincolns, but not Cadillacs.
No. I didn't say cataracts.
Oh, cataract, yeah,
Oh, no, my grandmother's Cadillac had a lot of problems.
I don't know if I had that,
Because that's what I said, that could have been a part of the blindness back then.
It
Because
could
they didn't
have.
have doctors and didn't have glasses and.
I don't know how many of our diseases we have today are as a result of man's messing up too. Because that could be very well be.
Only him.
Yes, I know.
All of them brother that.
Stage 2, in 825, he says, after that he put his hands again upon his eyes and made him look up. And he was restored and saw every man clearly. So 2 stages for this healing. Take the man out of town, but then the spit, transfused. Get that.
No, not
You
yet.
know, not quite, just a little
We're
bit.
not that fast.
When Jesus admonishes him, after the healing, after now the man could see clearly, Jesus' response to him admonishes him and says, don't tell anybody. Now I believe the reason for this is fairly simple. Remember, Jesus' priority was not to come to heal. But what do people want? Well, they want 2 things in life. They want health and wealth. And so those will sell. If you can figure out a health thing, it'll sell. How to make people rich, that'll sell. Because that's what, like I say, most people think will bring them happiness in life. And these so-called TV preachers that preach this prosperity theology, that's what they're teaching. Jesus healed as was prophesied, but that's not what he came for. But I imagine by this time, because there were certain towns Jesus went to where he healed everyone, there were followers, people following Jesus, not because they wanted a Messiah. They were following Jesus because they wanted to be healed, or their child to be healed, or what have you. Their friend, in this case, to be healed. And so they brought him. And Jesus, don't tell anybody what happened. Why? Because he didn't want a sideshow. It wasn't a circus where you come and watch Jesus perform all these great magic tricks. He came to verify that he was the Messiah, avoid publicity in that area. And very likely to establish a personal relationship with the man. Remember John chapter 9, the man was born blind there? The disciples asked him the question, well, who did sin, this man that was born blind, were his parents? Again, a foolish question, but a standard question people would ask. But the man, Jesus left after that point, after healing him. And the Pharisees started asking him, well, who healed you? What happened? And the man said, well, I don't know. All I know is I was blind, but now I can see. He had no knowledge of who Jesus was at that point. But when Jesus returned, the man finally recognized that Jesus was. When Jesus asked him, do you know? You know, the ministry is a very personal relationship we have with each other. I remember when I was in Bible college, we had chapel there. And you have these guest preachers come in, guest speakers. And there was one who was the head of an organization called Sword of the Lord. John R. Rice founded it, and he died in 1980. And then this guy, I think it was the one who took over after him. And he really prided himself in who he wanted everybody to know who he was. And he would come to a church service. If church service started at 7, he would get there about 10 minutes after. And then if it ended at 8, he would leave 10 minutes before and tell the preachers, I need to sneak out. I don't want people, shaking hands and all this stuff. I don't have time for that. And he came in late, like I say, to every service so people wouldn't, because he felt like he was a celebrity. And so it was all about him. And I remember I read the magazine that after he preached in chapel, I read the magazine afterwards just to see if anything was said there. And he said, I went to Piedmont, blah, 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 and gave the invitation. And he said almost half the people in the auditorium made a decision that day. What does that sound like he's saying? It sounded like saying about half people got saved. Well, I was in the service, and what he asked was, how many of you believe you're called into the ministry? It was a Bible college where 18-year-olds were going into the ministry. I mean, and yet, he acted like it's all about him. It just irks me when preachers make it all about them, or not only anybody, I don't care who it is, makes it all about them and not about Jesus Christ. Here Jesus came, again, not to put on a show, not to make a public spectacle. So, what's the answer to all this? I don't know. Why did he take him outside the city? I don't know. Sometimes the right answer, people, is I don't know. Because God doesn't tell us everything. So God will give us a story, and some of it, like you say, I get it. You see, you understand why he did this. Others will look at it and think, God, I have no idea what you're talking about. Believe it, but I don't know what you're talking about. It's like the Trinity. I don't understand the Trinity. I mean, I believe it. I believe the Bible is very clear about the Trinity. I have no doubts whatsoever about the Trinity. But can I understand it? No. Why? Well, first of all, that's the person of God. How can anybody understand the complete person of God? We are limited. We're finite in our thinking. God is infinite. So like I say, sometimes the answer is, the Bible didn't tell us. I don't know. Somebody asks you a question, you don't know the answer. It's okay. You don't have to know. I used to be a guy I knew that, I don't care what question you ask him about the Bible, always had an answer. Every single time. Rarely right, but he always had an answer. I mean, he would make stuff up. I mean, I heard him answer things 3 or 4 different ways. The same question. So, but he felt like he always had an answer. And you don't. Sometimes you can say, I don't know, the Bible doesn't tell us that. And that if that doesn't suffice, well, nothing I can do about that. And your answer could be, I don't know, but I'll try to find out. And then you go ask everybody, and nobody else knows, and you go back to them and say, I have no clue. Because there are some things God does not tell us. And that's fine. I have no problem with that. None of us should have a problem with that. The healings here, different passages. 2 men healed by the touch of their eyes. Remember why they touched the eyes?
They weren't saved.
Weren't saved. Two men healed with the touch and spit. Blind Bartimaeus healed with a simple word. John 9, man was healed with the anointing of the eye by the mud, the clay, and spittle.
Those are all Matthew, right?
Yes.
Well,
No,
and
John.
T's, yeah.
One's in Mark. Oh, actually, two's in Mark. 3 Matthew, 2 Mark, 1 John. And remember the healings were there to reveal that Jesus met the qualifications of any Messiah. God doesn't have to prove himself to us, but he does. There's times when he does explain himself. First Corinthians 14 says that signs are for the unbelievers. And that's why I say that where Jesus did a physical act, the person's lost. And the others are pretty obvious. Because when he doesn't use a physical means, usually it's going to come by phrase, thy faith has made thee whole. So as the wise men followed the star, they followed it because it was a sign in the Old Testament. They didn't know how to get there. They didn't know where Jesus would be born at. They knew he'd be born in Bethlehem, but they didn't know when he would be born. And that was all right for that. And the Jews did understand that Jesus was the Messiah and he would fulfill prophecy. Luke chapter 2 mentions a man by the name of Simeon. And Simeon was a great man of God. He served at the temple area. But he was told by God that he would not die until he saw the Lord's Christ or saw the Messiah. And when Jesus came in and they brought him in that day, I can't imagine what the joy that Simeon felt that day. He was told by God that he wouldn't die until the Messiah came. He saw the Messiah, knew that he would die sometime after that, maybe very shortly after that. But knowing God's plan, I mean, death to us is hard and it's harsh and it's awful in many, many ways to us. But to the believer, there's no problem there. The believer, when they die, have somebody present with the Lord. To those left behind, yes, it's harsh and it's a terrible thing to deal with for many people. As I mentioned before, in the physical action form, Jesus never mentions their faith. And there's a passage in 1 Corinthians 14. The one with the issue of blood. I mean, she touched Jesus' garment, but she had faith. It wasn't the touching of the garment that healed her, it was her faith. Actually, did that. Take a break.
Great.
Break.